Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hey, welcome in everyone. I'm Bernard Hickey, along with co-host Peter Bale, talking to you from bits of Auckland, reasonably close to the water, although the water seems to be cascading down from all parts, everywhere, all the time.
Yes,
at the moment.
Good metaphor, Bernard, or anecdote, yeah.
Yeah, so how's things? How's your week been?
Well, Bernard, I've been very focused on because you gave me the advice last week about just, getting a story done that I've been taking far too long to do, and I kind of pushed it out as you described, and it's been delivered. I sent you a version of it. I've been working on it. It's
fantastic.
It's
I'm
part
really
of my
looking
test
forward
to see whether I could actually ever write a book. Well, I'm not so sure. I don't know. I had those anxiety dreams about it last night, so it was kind of difficult. But I basically want to sort of move on now. But
good. No. As Sir Steve Hansen would say, flush the dunny and move on.
Yes. I must say, I find the new All Blacks coach rather odd, Razor Robinson, particularly his haircut. I'm not certain about his haircut.
Floppy thing. Have you seen him do the breakdance?
Yep. No,
good.
I haven't. Somebody, a friend of ours, in fact, invited me to the Greyland RSA the other day to watch the rugby on Saturday night, and I had to think for about a minute before I replied if I knew what the rugby actually was, and of course it was New Zealand versus France. So, but he did say that pokies and other things were available, but it did make me, I know I'm wearing my
bingo
Adidas All Black outfit now.
Going to the bowls and playing bingo, it's hot again.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't think there are bowls at the Greyland RSA, but there's everything else.
It would be a relaxing thing to do.
I'm big on RSAs.
Yeah, and it would be a relaxing thing
I think
to
we've
do.
said possibly. My dad was, after the war, went to the RSA and a few times, and he said to me, many years later, he said, "Peter, they just keep talking about the war."
Yeah,
which I thought didn't seem entirely unreasonable, but I could see that it may not be what he wanted to talk about at the time.
No,
and Bernard, I've been mentioned before.
Anymore.
I've been admiring your shirt. I mean, you look like a burst of spring.
Yes, I'm determined to make spring happen because it feels like the middle of winter right now. And yes, I'm very pleased with my shirt. In fact, I got an email from someone yesterday saying, "I saw your shirt. Where did you get it?" And that's the first time that's ever happened. So I feel like I'm some sort of...
Jesus Christ, by your standards, that's a huge fashion compliment, Bernard.
Oh, yeah. No. Suddenly I'm a clothes horse. And it's a Barker's shirt.
But you remember the audience, particularly my ex-mother-in-law ex-stepmother-in-law gets toey when we talk about clothes and buying them. And so where did you buy that beautiful $250 shirt, Bernard?
Oh no, I got it cheap on special at Barker's. So I'm thrilled to bits. New Zealand firm, although made with a fabric made in London actually called Liberty, which I love.
Oh yes.
Now, speaking of retiring,
is that
relaxing,
a Liberty shirt? Jesus Christ, this is all good, Bernard.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
All of the links to properties, and we may get money from the links. And if you click on the links in the show notes, we may get revenue from them.
Please like and subscribe too. I would be thrilled to see a shirt like this on Jerome Powell, the US Federal Reserve Chair. I suspect if he's out of a job, he will be happy to wear a shirt like this and go to the Greyland RSA for a quiet a glass of beer
I'll drop him a note.
And a game of bowls, and then maybe to play bingo, because it must feel a bit like that at the moment, just waiting for his number to be called by Donald Trump.
For the axe to, I was struck, Bernard, because of course you've preempted the question I was going to ask you, which was, Bernard, we sometimes talk about economics. There's a lot of stuff going down in the US at the moment with Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Trump's making him walk the plank, but then pulls him back from the edge at the end. Is that right?
Yeah, well, he was reported last night to have told a bunch of congressional members that he was going to sack Powell. He said repeatedly in public that he wants to sack Powell, has ordered him to the point of sending him a handwritten note, a list of Reserve Bank and central bank interest rates. And because at the moment the US Federal Reserve has interest rates over 4%, and is one of the higher ones, he's pointed down to 1% and said it needs to be down here, Jerome, or else. And it's the most extraordinary thing. But the markets are in this weird place where they've decided that Trump always chickens out. He's a taco Trump. And I'm
Yeah, I
not
don't,
so...
I don't know about so.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that he will chicken out in the end. And if he does actually
Go.
fire Jerome Powell, all hell will break loose, and we should buckle up. But at the moment, until it actually happens, no one believes it will actually happen. And so we're in this weird no man's land of everyone thinking Trump always chickens out until the moment he doesn't. Actually,
Exactly.
this week on tariffs, he hasn't chickened out at all. He's ordered and done deals and simply crossed out their numbers and said, you do this. In fact, he increased the tariffs on, for example, Japan. The stuff on Europe, if it goes to 30% in Europe, that's a real drama there.
I was you mean basically on as closest out markets with the stock markets. We're booming stock markets. Everybody's tickety boo, low taxes, hedge funds investing, blah blah blah. Nvidia doing brilliantly, and the big tech companies doing brilliantly. But that all comes to a screeching halt if the dollar drops, if US bond, there is a linkage between the fundamental markets, if you like, the dollar and the US treasuries, and the somewhat more flaky, if you like, equity markets. No?
Yes, because Americans, unlike New Zealanders, where we get quite grumpy when house prices fall, Americans get grumpy when their share prices fall. Did some research this week and found that the American stock market is worth around 2 times US GDP, and it's worth slightly more than the American housing market. And so for investors, and a lot more people are invested in the stock market there than here.
Yes.
They care about when the S&P 500 goes up or down. And also, they also care when the US 30-year Treasury bond yield goes up or down, because that means the 30-year mortgage rate, which is directly linked to that market interest rate, will go up or down. And this week, and I think this is an interesting development, the US 30-year bond yield went over 5% again for the first time, and that usually pushes mortgage rates in the States over 7%. And so that means you're not getting a lot of new houses built. People who usually refinance their mortgage to try and withdraw some equity from their home aren't able to do it. And the US economy is starting to slow down, although it's taking a bit longer than some people thought. And what's interesting is that we're not yet at the point where all these tariffs are pushing up prices, but it's coming, and it's hard to think of Donald Trump as being...
Well, we've seen the inflation is on the up there, where it's on the down in other places. We know that the tariffs are inflationary, but just one thing, because I deliberately wanted to ask you about this because of your view expressed previously that when the dollar gets into trouble, there's always going to be a bailout, and I'm just not sure that the bailout could be of sufficient scale to, the firing effectively of the Fed governor Fed chairman would be a bigger blip than normal. I mean, I don't know. How do you balance your agreement with me now that we're in trouble on the markets potentially, that there's a cloud over them?
I've seen the bailout multiple times in the last 20 years. And every time when it looked like there was no way anyone could stop this, the Fed steps in and buys government bonds, effectively printing money and also granting free US dollars to other central banks. And so every time it's done that, it has calms things down. It has effectively swamped the fire with dollars to get rid of it. And it'll do it again. That's why Bitcoin is at $120,000 per Bitcoin. and why an entire generation of investors basically hold on for dear life because they know there's always a bailout. Now, this is you
Well,
might you
I'm
might
just but
say,
but so what we're saying, Bernard, is we're not so sure that's true this time, right? Because I this is the first time I've heard
oh,
you agree with me that there is a potential crunch here.
yeah, there'll be some sort of crisis, but it can always be solved with money printing. And that's how the Fed has done it and will do it again, regardless of who's in charge. And Trump will definitely want the Fed to rescue his ass again with a whole bunch of money printing. So, yeah, no, I agree that there's a risk of some sort of eruption or a drama, but I still believe, because I've seen it multiple times, that the high likelihood is that the Fed will step in to save the global economy and financial markets and the big banks all over again, because that's what it always does. And effectively, people in the United States and most other places really believe that there is an underwrite. Effectively, rich
Yes.
people who own the stock market in the United States have an underwrite. They cannot be allowed to lose money in a substantial way. And the last thing you want to do is to bail out and then have to buy back in again at a higher price. And so
Yeah.
that's the hold on for dear life
Okay.
brigade.
So
That's
small
why
prediction
people,
here, Bernard.
yep.
I think with the Epstein thing and this, we are heading for an absolutely fascinating potential crisis with Trump himself, which could turn that on its head. Now, Bernard, before we go to Dr. Dyer, you wanted to make an interjection of the sort that we did a couple of years, or last year, with books and things like that. You have a cultural recommendation that you want to recommend at the top of the hour,
Yeah,
top of
I
the
mean,
show, rather.
yeah, it's not so much a culture thing. It's like a deep dive, fascinating article about the mechanics and politics of urban planning, and makes the case that urban planners are partly responsible for this dire housing affordability crisis we've got in much of the Western world. And it's a fascinating sort of insight into essentially culture, work culture, and the culture of bureaucracy. It's like Kafka for the housing market. And it's, I'll put a link in it to the show notes. It's one of those things I get excited about because I fundamentally believe we have two existential threats to our society, political economy. One is housing that is so unaffordable and awful, unhealthy, apart from anything else, that it will, well, it's already crippling our economy and society and contributing to our emissions and making us unhealthy. Not just here, but in many other parts of the world, although I think ours is the worst of the Western world. But secondly, of course, climate change and what that's doing to our planet. We only have to look at what's around us every day. Right now, it's pounding down with rain. I calculated last night, looking at one 1 hour news bulletin on One News. Of the 14 items in that one bulletin, 12 of them were about climate change. Sadly, climate change wasn't mentioned in any of the 12. So even the sports
You
stories.
mean, I see. So the subject, I mean, yeah, like Nelson and Tasman and everything else. Are you doing this as the longest segue ever to Catherine?
Oh, it was brilliant, wasn't it? It was a long, curving
was
run from the
beautiful.
boundary.
Landed nicely.
Yeah. And things to do with the climate often happen in unusual, sort of weird ways. And a really interesting paper this week, Catherine, out of with a bunch of scientists from the Northern Hemisphere who've done a whole bunch of work looking at how China in particular, but East Asia, has done a wonderful thing with the getting rid of a lot of the pollution in the atmosphere over the last couple of decades. You know, it was a real, it really was a pea super if you went to Beijing or Shanghai or the north of China 10 years ago. It's the sort of thing that the communist leadership there were really worried about. So they cleaned it up. They, changed a lot of things. It's one of the reasons they're doing their best to get rid of a lot of coal-fired power, at least shifting to solar, a lot of the growth. and they're still building coal-fired power stations, but
They put a lot of scrubbers that take out the
Exactly.
sulfur dioxide from the
Yeah.
emissions from the power
So this is the
stations.
opposite of the way of the way I read that headline, which is, China poisons world. The story is actually the
no.
other way around.
Yeah, they have reduced their poison in the world. Unfortunately, what that's done is taken a lot of the bits out of the atmosphere that were bouncing the light from the sun back out into the
We're
space.
back to albedo again. Yeah.
Exactly. And so,
Well, not quite,
Catherine,
actually,
tell us what they found and how frustrating it is.
It's quite an interesting study, this. So it kind of backs into that paper again a couple of years ago from James Hansen, which was talking about aerosols, which are these sulfur dioxide emissions, largely from burning coal, that have been masking climate warming. Yeah. And so in his paper, he talked a lot about marine emissions from the shipping industry. But that mostly has only happened since 2020, when there were new rules for marine emissions for ships. And so before that, there was still, there was a couple of decades, there have been a couple of decades of these, sulfur dioxide aerosols being brought down in China and Southeast Asian countries. And so this paper is suggesting that that's played a much bigger role in the recent acceleration of warming, because as that masking effect comes off, more of the radiative forcing from the sun comes in and stays in, basically creating warming. So I don't know, there were a couple of interesting things about the way that they wrote about this finding in the conversation, though. Did you notice that last sentence in it? You're nodding.
Yeah.
So the
What
report
was
that
the
we're
last
talking
sentence
about,
in it? Our poor audience can't bloody know what the last sentence is. Tell us what the
so
last
they
sentence
made a
was.
comment at the end that the recent acceleration may be short-lived because there's only so much pollution in the atmosphere that they can stop emitting, and once they've stopped emitting it all, that acceleration should stop. And so they said that was, the good news. And I kind of read that and I was a little bit like, yeah, this is like half the story, and you're kind of missing the other half of the story. And I almost feel a little bit like that pressure constantly to bright side all of these stories can end up with it being a little bit misleading, because I think if you read that, you would think, oh, that's great news. That means that warming that has recently happened is going to go away. And that's not the case at all.
What they're essentially saying is that the global economy will collapse so much that emissions stop, and eventually we'll solve the problem, which is not what we all want.
No, if you go back to the Hansen paper, what he said was, if your aerosols are masking climate change, then the climate change must be happening faster than what the models say. And if the models had the aerosol masking at too low of a number, if the masking effect was actually higher than they thought, then they must have had something else wrong in the models in order to have been accurate all this time. And the thing that they must have had wrong in the models in order to have had accurate predictions is climate sensitivity. So if you say that those aerosols were having a big effect, a big masking effect, much bigger than is in the models, then what you are also saying is probably that climate sensitivity is probably higher, or a lot higher than what we thought it was. And so what that means is, when you've finished, getting rid of these aerosols, the rate of warming is now higher because your climate sensitivity is higher, and it will stay higher. Now, it might not keep accelerating up like this, but it's not going to go back down either. It's going to stay on the plot that it's on right now. And we had a chart that was done by Leon Simons a couple of weeks ago we talked about, where he's an aerosols specialist in climate science, and he looked at these numbers and kind of said, if you take the rate of warming that we've seen over the last decade and just draw a straight line up to 2050, that's 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, and that's pretty catastrophic.
Yeah.
So this paper isn't saying that's not going to happen. They're saying it's not going to get worse than that.
And a laugh.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Brightside, you've got to look on the bright side sometimes.
Yeah.
And
It could have been getting worse, yeah.
It could have been getting worse.
But
It is
far out.
extraordinary to think that we are talking about this. And as I was saying, I went through that entire bulletin and climate change wasn't mentioned once. I did actually, some people have noticed my pleadings here, and that I did a long interview with Jesse Mulligan on RNZ this week talking about it. And it's interesting that the government is now done so much to just destroy policies to reduce emissions. There's actually been noticed overseas. There's a very interesting article in the last couple of days from a website called Drilled, an overseas website that specialises in climate change and climate change policies, very closely watched by people in the climate change community in the Northern Hemisphere, essentially calling out New Zealand as a quiet quitter. And it's interesting to the point where there are a whole bunch of people, farmers again, in Parliament, its select committee, and reasonably well-connected people to the government, seriously wondering whether New Zealand will pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which would be absolutely gobsmacking. But just finally, Catherine, companies who used to be all about targeting net zero and talking a good game about climate change are starting to show their true nature, one of which, although to be fair, it's a government owned company, New Zealand Post. Could you tell us what's gone on there?
Yeah, and I see a parallel or a connection between these two stories, and I'll tell you for why in a minute. So New Zealand Post has pulled out of the SBTI, or the Science Based Targets Initiative. We know that Air New Zealand has already pulled out of that, and Auckland Airport has already pulled out, and there are some, I think, about 36 other New Zealand businesses amongst the 10,000 global businesses that are signed up to the Science Based Targets that are still in the mix. And the thing that I find interesting, there's all sorts of different takes on all of these companies pulling out. What I find quite interesting is I think that Scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions for companies that are in the supply chain that they don't directly control, are genuinely getting harder for them to address because of all the pulling out. So
Yes.
they're operating
It'll have a
within
knock-on effect.
Yeah, they're operating within a system, and if everybody in that system is working on reducing their Scope 3 or supply chain emissions, then that has an impact. But if the key big players start to pull out, then it makes it much more difficult for the little guys to actually do anything about their Scope 3 emissions. And I think with companies, when they're balancing some things here, they're looking at what are the costs of emissions reductions versus what are the social costs and official sanctions that they might face if they don't reduce emissions. And so we're seeing a lot of this kind of around governments, around the Trump government and beyond that, where the social sanctions seem to be reducing. And so that's changing the calculation. And then if the costs to reduce your Scope 3 emissions are going up, that's further changing the calculation of what's actually worth doing for companies. So, yeah.
It's an unfortunate spiral, and it's even infecting our political sphere, where this week the Prime Minister and it seemed the leader of the Labour Party in opposition, Chris Hipkins, seemed to agree that the government couldn't afford to help buy out people when they needed to be relocated, which is quite a corrosive thing to say. And I actually don't think it's necessarily true that we can't afford it. We can always make choices about what we can afford when we properly tax people and we make decisions. And that is the worry here, that everyone pulls back and says basically it's every man, woman, household business for themselves. And that's chaotic. And what we don't understand is how dangerous that is, and how it's always the poor and the uninformed who get done over. Thank you very much, Catherine, for coming on.
Thanks,
great
Catherine.
to see you.
You've depressed us. I've got my bloody razor blades out. And
Thank you, Catherine.
can I introduce our regular guest, frequent guest, Sir, I was going to say Sir Robert Patton.
Sir Robert.
I've done that before.
Good evening,
Professor Robert
Good evening,
Patton.
Peter.
It's only a matter of time. And Helen Clark, who I asked to come on because she and I have been chatting a little bit in the background over the last few weeks, and she's been traveling a lot, and there's so much going on in this kind of international and domestic world of kind of highbrow politics a little bit. And I know our audience is really interested in what Helen has to say. I saw somebody say the other day, put up a picture of you and say, it wasn't Sean Plunkett actually, but somebody saying, are any of our current political leaders of the intellect of this person? And it was a picture of you. So without blowing smoke at you or whatever else it is, it's great to see you and have you on again.
Thanks.
I wanted to start, Helen, with a story that cropped up this week, and Bernard and I are not in disagreement, but we thought we had so there was a remarkable story, we thought, of Australia being asked by the United States to clarify whether, and apparently Japan was as well, to clarify whether they would come in if Taiwan was threatened. And we took a tiny step, and as the huge media empire that Bernard's Kaka is, we wrote to the Minister of Defence, Judith Collins, and she said, I have not been involved in any such decisions. Any decision to commit forces depends on circumstances and is a matter for the government of the day, which is good, of course, sensible. I will not comment or make commitments based on hypotheticals, brackets, and she didn't say this, just to be clear, even if the United States has in fact asked me to do this. And of course, she then talks about increasing our lethality and combat capability. But I thought it was really interesting she also said, of course, I do apologise, New Zealand and Australia share a very similar strategic assessment of the environment at the moment. Now, I thought, Helen, you and Robert would be just brilliant to tell us, put this in context, that the United States, we just had the qualification about AUKUS, that they're going to review AUKUS, and then this comes up. Where does New Zealand stand, do you think? Helen?
Well, fortunately, New Zealand doesn't have a dog in this fight at the moment, right? So Australia's in the position where it's signed up for purchasing these Virginia-class submarines from the US. The US always had a big waiver in the contract, and that said that providing it had enough supply of these submarines for itself. And actually, it doesn't have enough to meet what it says it needs. And so to hand them over to Australia in the face of that, of course, is a big call for them. Now, add to that the agreement was signed in President Biden's time, and President Trump doesn't like a lot of what President Biden did. It became known some weeks ago that this administration was reviewing the AUKUS contract. And I see as the sort of latest part of the saga that Australia is now being asked, well, would you intervene on our side in defence of Taiwan if it were invaded? You can see a lot of ifs in that.
Yeah.
And the implication is that you haven't got a prayer of getting your subs if the answer's not yes.
So
I
see. I thought you were going off the rails there a little bit when you brought in the AUKUS thing, and you said we don't, because I feel as though we do have a dog in this fight, because it's going to be our regional conflict and so on, and we send ships up through the China Sea. I see. So you're saying that this is like
AUKUS has been dropped, I understand, from the current 2025 iteration of the strategic defence plans for New Zealand. Mm-hmm. Someone's just sent me an OIA request on that. But no, I think for Australia, it's all about, do they get their subs? And, how much do they have to kowtow to get their subs? That's the issue. And of course, Anthony Albanese's just had what looks like quite a successful visit to China. And he's trying to work out how to chew gum and walk at the same time. But just as the Americans are putting the squeeze on as to whether he will side with them if they go to war over Taiwan, Chinese are putting the squeeze on because Australians agree with the Americans that a Chinese company shouldn't have a lease on the port of Darwin. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese are saying to Prime Minister Albanese,
hang on a minute.
You can't force us out of this lease. So this is all very dynamic in this triangle of relationships at the moment.
Well, let me ask Robert, would you come in on this just forget 1 second, Bernard, if you don't mind? I feel because we sometimes squeeze. Forgive me, because we should have discussed this offline. Robert, would you like to respond to what Helen said? Because I found it. I thought she was going off the rails slightly with mentioning AUKUS, and then she very sensibly brought it back to the. It almost sounded like somebody sent an email from Elbridge Colby in Washington while he was going through the AUKUS thing to say, okay, we're looking at this. Would it be, tell us about what you might do if Taiwan was invaded? Please go ahead, and then Bernard will come after.
Yeah, I agree with Helen's analysis. The thing I would say is that there's a certain irony of the United States asking Australia this question, or indeed, if it's informally asked this question of New Zealand, because this administration, the Trump administration, has done more to boost the Chinese international position than any administration I can remember in recent history. Tariffs have played into the hands of the Chinese leadership of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has presented China as the champion of free trade now. And secondly, Trump's disastrous policy towards Ukraine, which even he's retreating from now, again, has done nothing to weaken, if that's the right way of putting it, or dilute Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. If anything, China would look at Mr. Trump's policy of snuggling up to Mr. Putin for the first 6 months of his administration and see that as sheer weakness. And so I think that it's a bit of a cheeky request, really, because Australia could actually reverse the question. When are you going to stop boosting the Chinese leadership? Because, I think there's a certain incoherence, in short, with the American foreign policy at the moment.
Helen, could I ask, how does the mechanisms at the top of government work to game out, to plan ahead when a question like this might be coming? How does, MFAT, the security apparatus, the Prime Minister's office, all of these things, how do they think ahead on this? Because you want to be able to have an answer ready if someone was to come at you. How do you think New Zealand should plan or prepare for the inevitable question if this happens? Because America believes, and China has said that China will be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. How would New Zealand's diplomats and governmental figures, how would they plan or game out what our answer would be if America said, who are you going to choose, us or China, and will you join us with a few rockets and drones in defending Taiwan?
Well, the defence policy settings New Zealand has had since the Longi government would not see New Zealand buying into that fight. But as we know, the current government has been increasingly trying to reposition New Zealand vis-a-vis the United States. So the jury's out on what the New Zealand response would be. But I would think in the first place, they would be wanting to brainstorm over what they think China's intentions actually are. Now, there's a very interesting op-ed from Gareth Evans, the former Australian Foreign Minister, that's just been published. And Gareth refers to having been in Beijing recently and being convinced that the talk from Beijing is not about the imminence of an invasion, but rather a shot over the bow of a Taiwan president who might want to, declare for once and all independence and instead of leaving the issue open as Taiwan always had. So we're on shifting sand here, because the American position used to be to keep a strategic ambiguity over whether it would in fact defend Taiwan. That's a bit less ambiguous now, but is it really? is it really if it invokes the prospect of World War III with China? And as to what China's real intentions are, well, Gareth Evans, who's a very experienced actor, is certainly not convinced that its intentions are that it's about to invade Taiwan. I hope I'm not proved wrong tomorrow or next year, but that's his assessment.
So how did you go about, your government, go about answering that question when America came to New Zealand and said, we want you to join us in invading Iraq?
Well, it never said that. And I think because New Zealand made its intentions fairly clear from an early stage, as I've often said, we were sounded out a year before in London. And I gave a pretty firm response then to an informal sounding out. So we were never approached. And that's the position that you want to be in. Ideally, New Zealand should be positioned so it is not asked this question that Australia and Japan have been asked.
But Trump's such a wild card.
Because that's a very diplomatic answer, Helen. Somebody, you mean you wouldn't just fire off a letter to the UN and say, to an ally and be rude to them? Good on you, Bernard. Sorry, I was interjecting unreasonably.
I can see how the machinations behind the scene don't put anyone in an awkward position. But we've got Trump, who's quite happy to post in the middle of the night, just after he's been to the loo or whatever. Why don't you do this? Or I'm outraged that you didn't do this. And we all wake up to have to answer the question. Trump wants us to do this. What do we do?
But this is why New Zealand should stay below the radar, rather than pushing ourselves into his face. Stay below the radar. We've got a lot of interests. We've got trade interests with the US. We've got trade interests with China. I think just get on, do our business, trying to grow our economy, employ people, keep our young people here. We don't need to buy into this fight. That would be my strategy if I was still sitting on the 9th floor of the Beehive.
Robert, just to take up that question assertion that Helen just made about first of all, it was some time ago in this conversation that we don't have a dog in this fight, but we also need to keep our head down, because sometimes I feel in our conversations with you and even with Helen that we've criticised the government for not keeping its head down too much. That there have been moments in big diplomatic questions over the past 3 years that we've been doing this podcast where we felt New Zealand has been a little bit too discreet.
I think this government hasn't always, in practice, supported the principles that it says it upholds. And I think that's disappointing. And we've spoken about Gaza. If you look at if you look at New Zealand's record in the UN since the Hamas terrorist attack, in principle, New Zealand's position has been quite clear. But outside the UN, we haven't always walked the talk. So what I would say is that I regret that. I think I agree with Helen. In New Zealand's influence, having good relations with two superpowers depends on not too clearly aligning with one against the other. And it's not in our interest to do that. But, of course, our interests are not identical to either China or the United States. And we do have a vision of international relations, which is, I think, much more committed to a rules-based system than either. And we mustn't lose sight of that. And I think it is possible for New Zealand to have good relations with both superpowers, but not take a backward step of a commitment to strengthening rules rather than being passive while they're being weakened. And, I think sometimes the government, and I'm not wishing to be partisan here, I think, it's easy to be critical when you're an academic and looking on and you don't have the responsibility. I take that point. But I do think there have been times when the government could have spoken up.
No idea what you're talking about, but...
Yeah, I think sometimes our silences have been rather deafening on crucial moral issues in global politics. And unfortunately, or fortunately, we live in an interconnected world and people do notice.
But one thing we can do is control how much we spend on defence, which is the sort of ultimate test of how, serious you are and what you're doing. And obviously the Americans and the Australians watch how much we spend on defence. They probably don't care how much we spend on social housing or school classrooms, but they go, we know it's 1.18% of GDP and we just spent 2.5% of GDP or whatever it is. Helen, do you think we should significantly increase our defence spending? I say this having seen the coverage of the exercise Talisman Sabre in Australia in the last week, which apparently is the largest ever joint exercise of militaries in which New Zealand, Australia, the United States, elsewhere were doing a whole lot of practice with things like HIMARS and drones and all sorts of things. Should we be increasing to more like 2.5%?
No, I don't agree with that. I don't think that it's useful expenditure at all. And I'm looking at the global pressure that the Trump administration is putting on Western countries to spend more. Remember, we are not in a formal alliance relationship with the United States, so they really should have no ability to leverage New Zealand defence spending. The 5% that NATO is being asked for is just a figure plucked out of thin air. There's no particular basis for it at all. And the worry I have is that as NATO ratchets up spending, as Russia ratchets up spending, they can both bankrupt each other. I think the sensible thing is to try, when the Ukraine conflict is frozen, as one hopes it is sooner rather than later, certainly not before the end of the summer because they'll fight all summer, but after that there can then be some adult discussion about a security architecture for Europe which doesn't see the two sides bankrupting each other. I mean, the impacts for Britain, for example, of going to 5% of GDP defence spending are immense. They've managed the first tranche by slashing their overseas development assistance to levels unseen in decades. But you can't keep doing that because there's not much left to cut. So if you're going to keep growing the defence budget and growing, you're going to get into the NHS, you're going to be cutting into education, basic social services. And you've seen how in very recent weeks, the Starmer government tried to cut, for example, disability benefits and the winter pensions payment.
Yes.
Absolute outrage by the Labor backbench, had to back off. So none of this is easy. And as I say, the time must come for an adult conversation about a security architecture for Europe where both sides are not bankrupting each other.
Robert,
Helen,
on defence?
If I could bring in something that Robert... Oh, sorry. Do you want to talk... Bernard, do you want to ask Robert a question on defence?
On that defence issue, because, there's a lot of pressure, not just from the Americans, but the Australians.
Yeah, I mean, I would slightly disagree with Helen on this, and Helen and I know that we disagree with each other on this. I think that I do think that New Zealand needs to raise its defence expenditure, but I also agree it can't be done under external pressure. The reason I support a slight increase in defence expenditure, certainly not more than 2%, but the reason I support that is not so that New Zealand becomes ever closer to the United States or Australia, actually, for that matter, although I think Australia and New Zealand, Australia is a formal ally, I think it would help. It might even make the Australians less reliant on the United States in one sense. But the reason I support this is I think that many security problems, by definition, have to be resolved multilaterally. And I think it would mean that New Zealand can bring something to the table, something more than it has at the moment. And my motivation for increasing defence expenditure would not be to please Washington or necessarily Australia, but I do think it would be part of our, vision for having a rules-based system which we can contribute to multilateral solutions.
But that doesn't require vast expenditure on frigates and heaven knows what else. Basically, multilateral peacekeeping requires boots on the ground. And we've done very little of it, apart from the ongoing commitment to the multinational force in the Sinai, policing the agreement between Egypt and Israel. We don't have any substantial contingent of peacekeepers anywhere that I can see.
Yeah. I think probably everybody else has too. Helen, just swiftly, because I want to move on to some other issues. I want to move on to the UN. I want to move on to Israel and some sort of international diplomatic issues. But somebody on our feed, right, not unreasonably, or says Helen's stuck in 2022. She's not thinking about the world as it is since the invasion of Ukraine when it comes to defence spending. Would you like to have a little opportunity to say, no, I'm not?
I don't think the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has any bearing on what New Zealand should spend on defence. End of story.
Really?
A long way away. Yeah.
Okay. I think that one might come back to bite us on the bottom if we're not investing in drones. But Helen, we were also talking, when we talked ahead of this about UNRWA, the UN, the inadequacy of the UN, it seems to me, in handling what's going on or in contributing in a useful way to what's going on in Israel, Gaza. We've had Ehud Olmert this week talking about concentration, the current Israeli policy being to create a concentration camp in Gaza. I mean, what is the, and then of course, I'm sorry, forgive me, we've also had this incident the last couple of days where Israel has attacked the Syrian Ministry of Defense in Damascus and made various moves to protect, theoretically, the Druze population adjacent to the Golan Heights, I think they are, which is where it comes down into Israel. In the Druze population, I mean, how do you see the UN's role in that sort of complex dilemma at the moment?
Well, the truth is the UN hasn't been much of a player in this at all. It's pretty much kept at bay. When there are efforts at the Security Council by member states to try to get resolutions, the US is blocking anything that might criticize Israel's behavior. The UN agencies have been blocked from doing humanitarian relief into Gaza now, which is pretty dramatic. And you would have seen that the sanctioned, the allowed aid delivery, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, has ended up being a pretty deadly one where desperate people trying to get food are regularly shot and killed. There's been hundreds killed now, I think 800 trying to get food from them. So it's a complete mess, of course. And the proposals put up by the Defense Minister of Israel for literally herding the population of Gaza into a tiny strip of territory described as a concentration camp by the former Prime Minister of Israel. I mean, it's pretty dramatic. Robert referred earlier to times when we should be speaking, and he's right that while New Zealand has voted, the right way on the Gaza issues at the General Assembly ever since 7 October, generally New Zealand government's pretty silent on the war crimes by the dozen being committed in Gaza, and that is concerning. Other Western countries, Spain for example, have a great deal more to say. Okay,
two more questions, but Robert, would you I always worry about squeeze. Robert, would you like to reply to that aspect of it? We've got this kind of extraordinary, Helen's been on a few times and talked about UNRWA partly because I've asked her to. I think UNRWA had 7,000 distribution points, and I think this new organization has 2 in Gaza. There's a very dark game being played here.
There is, and we can't afford to be silent because to the victims of what's happening, it looks like complicity. And New Zealand, we are in an interconnected world. There is a tendency sometimes in this country to think, well, no one takes any notice. I mean, I think the Deputy Prime Minister said not long ago, who cares what New Zealand thinks on issues in the Middle East, or words to that effect. Well, people do care. And by the way, I think it's important that New Zealand, and hopefully with other countries which are like-minded, are very firm in the way that the US and Israel has displaced the UN. a really cynical move, and they are not disinterested players.
Yes.
And the appalling humanitarian situation in Gaza, it seems to me that other liberal democracies, including our own, should be prepared to publicly disagree with the United States when the Trump administration engage in the sort of policies they're doing. And we have to obviously pick the issues. As Helen once said before, we can't be responding to everything the Trump administration does. I agree with that. But we do need, I think, to strategically, on issues of international concern, certainly not pull our punches.
So, Helen, you were a candidate at one point for the Secretary General's job. It seems to me we haven't heard really from Antonio Guterres for a while, and I can sort of understand why he's got his tin hat on. Where is multilateralism sitting at the moment? I mean, Michael Waltz from the who was fired as security advisor in the White House hasn't yet been confirmed as U.S. ambassador to UN, and today he said his objective was to make the UN great again. Do you think the UN is vulnerable right now? Helen?
Yes, you're breaking up, Peter.
So I thought you were just giving an incredible pause where the answer could only be yes, but please go ahead.
So the question, Helen, was...
No, you're breaking up a bit, but
is the UN fundamentally vulnerable at the moment?
Well, look, I don't want to be unfair to Antonio Guterres because he is actually saying quite a lot on the Gaza crisis. He spoke out on the Iran strikes by the US and Israel, which were clearly contrary to international law. He's spoken out on the recent Syria bombing. So he's trying to do his bit, but he has a Security Council that's not going to act on any of it because the US will veto it. But I don't think he can be criticized for not speaking out. He has spoken out. It's just that the great powers are not letting the UN Security Council near the major conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Helen, just this is what we call a segue on this thing, which are usually incredibly clumsy, and this is another one. Our Minister for Regulation responded to a letter from the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Indigenous Rights, to a letter that had been written about our responsibilities. What did you make of that? I know you don't want to talk about the specific bill that they were referring to so much, but what do you make of that interaction with the UN and these areas where we've signed up for obligations and have obligations, and yet what do you make of it?
Well, I think, the fracas over this, apart from the tone of the Seymour letter, which was somewhat aggressive, he really shouldn't have been responding. It was Winston Peters' job as the foreign minister to respond, not David Seymour as deputy prime minister. And I think that's where Seymour was sort of wrapped on the knuckles by the prime minister. Prime minister, by the way, said he didn't disagree with the letter, and I think that's a bit poor because the letter was not the sort of communication that should be exchanged between the UN system and the government of New Zealand. But be that as it may, presumably Winston Peters will now send a formal response. How different it is from the one that Seymour sent, who knows? But I think people are dancing on the head of the pin that he shouldn't have sent the letter.
But part of it was, I don't want to sound old, that was exactly my reaction when I saw it, was that it was not his job, it was the foreign minister's job to respond. But let me ask you an actual question about that, because it's a question with a slight twist in the back there. There's a lot of discussion about our obligations to the UN, the way UN is unelected and so on. There's a sort of movement against some of these international responsibilities that we have. What would you say to the current government about our responsibilities to the UN, to agreements that we've signed up for? And then I want to ask Robert to come in, because he's so strong on this idea of rules-based approaches. But that seemed like a real kick in the teeth to UN when we had actually signed up to that process.
No, not entirely, because the UN has layers of agreements, right? There are treaties and conventions.
Yeah.
This was a declaration. It's not a treaty or convention. In that sense, it doesn't place obligations.
Did you sign up to this one?
No, we didn't. Because
was the declaration? Did you sign up to it, or was it?
No, we
somebody
did not.
else?
It was the John Key government. We felt that it cut across the processes we had in place with the Waitangi Tribunal and with direct negotiations between iwi and the government. So we didn't sign it.
Because you were already in a process. So what is our obligation under that then?
Well, there aren't obligations. That's the point. It's a declaration, but it doesn't create obligations like a treaty. If it were a treaty, then there would be obligations, but it isn't a treaty.
So in fact, are you in a weird way actually on side with David Seymour, where he says don't interfere in a very complicated arrangement that you don't understand?
I'm not backing his letter at all, because I think it was quite aggressive. But on the legal
that would be news.
On the legal point, the declaration is not a treaty which creates obligations.
Thank you, Robert. Do you want to talk about this at all? Address this point of
I don't think I can add much more than Helen's had, but I would say that I have the feeling there is almost a certain glee amongst certain political actors at the moment in scapegoating the UN. As Helen's already indicated, the UN is in an unenviable position, actually, because it is a much needed international institution. Many of the key problems we face cannot be solved by states acting alone. And yet we're in this awful halfway house. We have a UN which is often a bystander, even marginalized in some of the most dangerous challenges and problems we face. And yet we have politicians scoring points off it for not doing enough or interfering. And I think we need to be clear as a country that the UN needs reforming. The UN Security Council in particular needs reforming. And we should be very clear about this. We should try to support the UN, but not without, not unreservedly, to indicate how it can improve. And I think that position has been broadly taken by many governments, going back to Peter Fraser, that the UN is important for New Zealand. It's not just important for New Zealand. If you believe in international affairs based on rules, then you do need key international institutions to make sure those rules are upheld and principles respected. And I do worry when I hear politicians in New Zealand sort of saying, oh, well, the New Zealand UN is pretty irrelevant. Well, I tell you what, if there's an international free-for-all in which the UN is completely discredited, countries like New Zealand and many middle powers will be the biggest victims. And so that's
Robert,
what
thanks very much for that. Yep. Brilliant. We need to help you work out the last moments, because and Helen, thanks that Bernard has the last thing. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Just one question for Helen. Your favorite book of the week that you're reading at the moment?
Well, I'm so busy reading the news headlines, I'm not reading a book at all. That's the short answer.
Know the feeling. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, thank you so much for coming on. It's been wonderful to have you.
No, we did, because I asked you that before, because we so enjoyed that last time you did
it. Thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Again,
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Peter, we're ending the show.
But that's kind of interesting, isn't it? How we? I mean, I'm. 1 minute, are we? Yeah.
No,
we're still talking to each other.
Yeah. We still got a minute left. Yep.
People have complained, and I can see it now. So I think I have pretty good fiber and Wi-Fi in my house. People have complained quite a lot tonight about various internet-y things. So if it's, I mean, I shut down everything. We do our best. Of course, the true edited version is by our lovely colleague and friend Simon Josie, who does the edited, because this is really the raw and unplugged. This is when Bernard and I do our unplugged.
This is the Kaka
version,
unplugged.
right,
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you. You've got just to end it, Peter.
Yeah.
You've got a
Yeah.
skateboarding
So
dog.
shall I do the which one would you like? The Johnny Depp one or the Donald Trump Jr. one? Because I don't think we've got time for both of them.
Junior, please.
The Johnny Depp one.
No,
Junior.
the
Okay.
Donald Trump Jr.
So yesterday, yesterday, the what's called the Amazon of guns floated on the New York Stock Exchange, promoted by Donald Trump Jr. And it is called Grab a Gun, and it allows you to order guns. Amazingly, of course, because they're guns, oddly, in most of the 50 states, you have to go to a gun. You can order them online and then go and get a gun from a gun shop so they can actually see vaguely who you are and that you don't have a T-shirt that might incriminate you. However, you can still get accessories and ammunitions just delivered direct to your home. And it has the ticker, the stock exchange code, like Microsoft's is MSFT. This one is PEW, Pew. And Donald Trump Jr. said, it's a little takeoff of pew, pew, like shooting a gun.
It is amazing.
Pew,
They are
pew, Bernard.
such a
See you
bunch
later.
of hustlers. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll be back again in a week. Ka kite anō. Bye-bye.